In today's exciting episode, we are making a white oak frame with easy replaceable photos. I also show a tip on making splines without a jig. So let's hop to it and start the build. I had some white oak and walnut offcuts that was perfect for this frame, and I ripped them down to the desired dimensions that I wanted. They were roughly 1.5 by 3/4. I measured out the blade depth for the slot for the photos, and I made sure just to give enough wiggle room so it wasn't too difficult to take the pictures out. And I know this isn't a professional way for making frames, but I wanted something different where it was easy to replace my photos anytime I wanted a change in scenery. With everything digital nowadays, it's always nice to have something tangible, and I find that photos bring back the rush of memories. Here I'm just cutting down the 45s and sizing up my frame. For the picture size, I'm using a 4x6 picture. With this style of frame, you just have to account for the size of the picture and the depth of your slot. For this piece, I'm just marking out the top. I'm going to rip this down once it's all glued together so I have that slot to slide in the photos. And now it's time to glue up. I find 45s a little bit tricky when gluing up, but I have this band clamp that I used for this, and it worked out great. But another option is also using blue or green tape and taping up the corners so that it holds it tight. I'm giving it a little sanding action to take off that extra little bit of glue and smooth out the edges. I'm ripping down the frame for the slot for the picture, and I'm going to add splines on the corners as well. So right now it kind of seems a little unnecessary, but it will make sense in a second. Now I'm not a big fan of making jigs, so I found this awesome way to make a spline, and this spline gives you a perfect cut. I learned this from Inspire Woodcraft on YouTube. I'll link his video down below, but essentially you rip down two pieces that are equal to the size of the fence and the distance to your blade. And now you'll have two perfectly ripped pieces. And you take your two perfectly ripped pieces side by side and run it through the blade, but don't run it fully through the stock. This will give you the perfect blade thickness for your spline, but make sure not to cut all the way through. So this piece you're going to flip over and have the unfinished cut side towards the blade. And so you'll have this piece in this direction right here. And with the other extra piece that you cut, you will add it to that little slot, and that would essentially give you the perfect spline thickness. Now I wouldn't recommend this if you're not comfortable with a table saw, but it works really well. And all you have to do is just make sure you take your time and take it slow. So I don't end up cutting all the way through because I will cut it with a handsaw. So essentially this piece is the perfect thickness of the blade. And I'll show you in a second here. But first, I'm marking out the perfect 45-degree on my picture frame and the depth that I want my spline to be in. I'm not going to be using any spline jig here, but I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. I bring my table saw blade as close to the desired depth that I want my spline. Now I know it won't be perfect, but it'll be really close. And once I am happy with the position of the blade, I put a mark on my fence. This will give me a guide on how deep I want my spline to be. And so I mark center, and it's time to cut. This is a fairly easy, straightforward process that doesn't need a spline jig. But there are also many ways to doing it as well, but I also like this process. And with those two aligned, our spline fits really well. I think with a proper table saw, I could get it even tighter, but I'm happy with this, and now it's time to glue them up. I don't often do splines, but I find they are a nice accent piece to a frame or a certain type of projects. I'm also a fan of the contrasting woods in certain situations, and for picture frames, I don't mind at all. Now this frame isn't a perfect picture frame with glass inserted and all the fixing on a typical frame, but I do like the idea of changing your pictures on the fly. I used my flush cut saw to cut down the splines. It worked out super good, kept it flush, and then I ended up sanding it down to give it that perfect smoothness. It's always nice to take out some hand tools here and there, and they always have a place in my shop, so I'm always happy when I get to put them to good use. I went through my grits to sand down the frame, typically 80 to 220, depending on the certain situations, and then I hand sand the edges just to soften them up a bit, and clean up any other places that I missed, and to test it out to see if the picture frame works. Osmo Poly X is the finish of choice that I used. Typical process is 2 coats, and your first coat you wait 8 to 10 hours and then do the second coat and wait for another 8 to 10 hours. There are many finishes out there and they're all great and they all have their place and purpose. Family photos are always very important to me. It's just so satisfying in a digital age. So if you have a photo album kicking around, round up your family and go through it. Bring the Russia memories back in. And spend a couple hours on talking about each photo and what happened in it. Because pictures come and go, but memories last a lifetime.